The knife was already at my throat when the doors of the great hall burst open. I did not scream. Screaming was for the weak, and I was the daughter of the Thessaline throne, even with cold metal pressed against my skin and a stranger's hand shaking around the hilt. My eyes searched the crowd of nobles who had gone silent, who had stopped breathing, who were doing nothing, nothing at all. Then I saw him, my husband, standing near the wine table where he had been standing all evening, holding a glass he had barely touched, looking as if none of this concerned him. I remember thinking, even then, even with my life balanced on a blade's edge, that Elias Marsh would probably just apologize to the man holding me and ask him nicely to stop. That was who I believed I had married. A gentleman, a polite man, a man so soft that the court called him my punishment rather than my husband. I did not know, in that moment, that within 3 heartbeats the knife would be gone from my throat, the man holding it would be face down on the marble floor, and my husband would be kneeling beside me, checking my neck for a wound with hands that did not shake at all. I did not know that the 2 Concord guards stationed at the door, veterans who had survived 3 border wars, would step back from him as if he carried a fire they did not want to touch. I did not know that this was only the beginning of everything I had gotten wrong about the man I married. My name is Veyron, second daughter of the Thessaline Dominion, and this is the story of how I discovered that the harmless man in my bed was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, and how gods older than my ancestors' ancestors would one day kneel because of him. But to understand the ending, you must first understand how little I thought of him at the beginning. The marriage was arranged the way all such marriages are arranged among the great houses, which is to say, without any regard for what either of us wanted. Earth had recently joined the Concord of Worlds, a loose alliance of star nations that mostly existed so no one would go to war without at least pretending to talk first. My father, ever the strategist, decided that a marriage between his daughter and a human diplomat would strengthen ties with this new, unproven species while costing him almost nothing, since humans were, by every account, harmless. That word followed Elias everywhere. Harmless. The other nobles used it like a title. Prince Consort Elias the Harmless. They said it to his face sometimes, thinking he would not understand the insult buried in the kindness of the word. He always smiled when they said it. He never once corrected them. I remember the day he arrived at the palace. I had expected someone impressive, at least in appearance. Someone who carried himself like a diplomat should, with sharp eyes and a straight spine and the practiced confidence of a man who represented an entire world. Instead, I got a man of average height, with tired brown eyes and an easy, forgettable face, wearing a suit that did not quite fit him properly. He bowed to me with the wrong depth, a mistake that made 2 of my ladies-in-waiting hide their laughter behind their sleeves. "I apologize," he said, in careful, accented Thessaline. "I was told the bow should be 40 degrees. I may have miscounted." "You miscounted by at least 10 degrees, I told him, not bothering to hide my irritation. "It makes you look as though you are afraid of me." "Maybe I am," he said, and smiled, and I remember rolling my eyes at what I assumed was an attempt at charm. That was Elias. Always a little late to the joke, always a little clumsy with our customs, always willing to laugh at himself before anyone else could. For the first few months of our marriage, I treated him the way most of the court treated him, which is to say, as a formality I had to endure. I attended functions beside him. I let him sit at my table. I did not share my thoughts with him, and he never once tried to force his way into my confidence. He spent his days doing diplomat things, meetings and papers and long, boring sessions with trade representatives from a dozen star systems. He spent his evenings reading, mostly, books in 6 or 7 languages that he kept stacked on every surface of his study. He was polite to the servants in a way that confused them, because on Thessaline, servants were not spoken to as equals, and yet Elias always thanked the young man who brought his tea by name, always asked the woman who cleaned his study how her children were doing. The court found this strange. I found it strange too, though I would not have admitted it back then. I assumed it was a human weakness, a softness bred into a species that had not yet learned how the universe actually worked. There were small moments, though, that I dismissed too quickly. Once, at a formal dinner, a noble named Korath, a large and loud man from a warrior house that despised the very idea of an alliance with Earth, decided to make sport of my husband in front of 40 guests. He mocked Elias's accent. He mocked his clumsy bow. He asked, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, whether humans fought their wars with strongly worded letters, since they clearly had no stomach for anything else. The table laughed. I did not laugh, mostly because I was embarrassed, and I remember feeling a flush of anger that I did not fully understand at the time. Elias simply set down his fork, looked at Korath with an expression of mild, patient interest, and said, "We do write very strongly worded letters, but if letters fail, we have other methods. I promise you, you would not enjoy hearing about them over dinner." Korath laughed loudest of all, delighted at what he assumed was a joke, a small human trying to sound dangerous. The rest of the table laughed with him. I laughed too, though something in Elias's voice, some flatness underneath the polite words, had made the hair on my arms rise for just a moment before I dismissed it as nothing. I wish I had listened to that moment more carefully. I wish I had noticed how Korath's laughter faded a half-second before everyone else's, how his eyes flicked toward Elias one more time before he changed the subject entirely, unprompted, moving the conversation somewhere safer. At the time I thought nothing of it. Looking back, I understand now that Korath, brute that he was, had heard something the rest of us had missed. There were other small things too, small enough that I built a story around them without ever questioning the story itself. Elias never raised his voice, not once, not even when the staff made mistakes that would have earned a beating in my father's house a generation earlier. Elias never carried a weapon, though every noble in the palace, myself included, wore at least a ceremonial blade at all times. Elias walked through the palace gardens alone at night, unguarded, in a city where kidnapping a member of the royal family for ransom or leverage was not unheard of. I asked him once, early in our marriage, whether he was not afraid, walking alone like that. Afraid of what? He asked, genuinely curious, as if the question had not occurred to him before. Of being hurt, of being taken. You have no guards, you carry no weapon. He considered this for a moment, the way he considered most things, slowly and carefully, like a man weighing stones in his hands. "I suppose I never think about it," he said finally. "Should I?" I told him yes, of course he should, and he nodded and said he would try to be more careful, and then he went right on taking his evening walks alone, unguarded, unarmed, and unharmed, night after night after night. I thought this was foolishness. I thought this was the naivety of a young species that had not yet learned fear the way older worlds had learned it. I did not think, not once, that perhaps he was unafraid because he understood, better than any of us, exactly what would happen to anyone foolish enough to try something. The court's opinion of him did not soften with time, though mine, slowly and against my own wishes, began to shift. It was not any single event that changed my mind. It was the accumulation of small things, small contradictions that did not fit the story everyone had agreed to tell about the harmless human prince. There was the matter of the languages. I discovered, quite by accident, that Elias spoke not only Thessaline, which he had learned for our marriage, but at least 10 other languages from across the Concord, some of them dead languages spoken only by scholars, some of them dialects so obscure that even our translation devices struggled with them. When I asked him about this, he shrugged and said he had always found languages easy to pick up, as though this were an ordinary talent and not something that had taken most of my own tutors decades to master in even 2 additional tongues. There was the matter of his scars. I saw them only once, by accident, when he removed his jacket during an unusually warm summer evening and rolled up his sleeves. Thin white lines along his forearms, old and faded, the kind of marks that come from a blade, not an accident. When I asked, He told me a story about a childhood injury, something about a fall from a tree, and the story was smooth and believable, and delivered without a single moment of hesitation. It was only later, much later, that I understood the smoothness itself was the tell. A man telling the truth about a childhood accident stumbles a little over the details. A man telling a well-practiced lie does not stumble at all. There was the matter of the older Concord officials, the veterans, the ones who had served during the earliest days of Earth's contact with the wider galaxy. I noticed, slowly, that these particular individuals treated Elias differently than everyone else did. They did not mock him. They did not call him harmless. When his name came up in conversation, they grew quiet, or changed the subject, or found some polite reason to excuse themselves. I noticed a Concord admiral, a decorated woman named Halveth, who had commanded fleets in 3 separate conflicts, go pale and stiff the single time Elias greeted her by name at a diplomatic reception. She recovered quickly, smiled, made polite conversation, but her hands did not stop trembling for the rest of the evening, and I saw her leave early, claiming a headache that I do not believe existed. I began to watch him more closely after that. Not out of affection, not yet, but out of the same instinct that makes a hunter pause when the forest goes quiet for no visible reason. Something was wrong with the story I had been told about my husband, and I intended to find out what it was. I started with small questions, asked casually over dinner, disguised as idle curiosity. Where had he served before becoming a diplomat? What had he done during Earth's early years in the Concord, back when humanity was still an unknown quantity to the rest of the galaxy? He answered every question smoothly, deflecting with humor, turning the conversation back toward me, toward my day, toward anything except himself. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who calls me harmless," he said once, smiling in that easy way of his, though his eyes, just for a moment, held something sharper. "I have never called you harmless," I said, which was true. I had simply believed it, without ever saying the word aloud. "No," he agreed, "you haven't." I did not understand then why that small distinction seemed to matter so much to him. I understand it now. He had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for someone to look closely enough to notice the difference between what everyone assumed about him and what he actually was. He had been waiting, I think, for me. That night, after he had gone to sleep, I sat awake in the dark of our chambers and stared at the ceiling, turning over every strange detail I had collected, like pieces of a puzzle I did not yet have the full picture for. The unshaken hands, the unafraid walks through dangerous gardens, the languages learned too quickly, the scars explained too smoothly, the way soldiers who had survived wars went quiet at the mention of his name. I did not know yet what I had married, but I knew, with a growing certainty that kept sleep from finding me until the first light of morning touched the windows, that it was not what the court believed. It was not what I myself had believed for months. Whatever Elias Marsh truly was, harmless was not the word for it. And 3 days later, when the knife touched my throat in the great hall and vanished within 3 heartbeats, I would finally begin to understand exactly how wrong that word had always been. The man who held the knife to my throat was named Bractus, a minor lord from a house that had lost standing after my father's rise to power. I learned his name later from the guards who dragged him away, though in the moment itself I knew nothing except the cold edge against my skin and the sudden, impossible speed with which my husband crossed the room. I did not see him move. That is the truth of it, and I have told this story enough times now that I no longer feel foolish admitting it. One moment Elias was standing by the wine table, glass in hand, looking bored. The next moment the glass was falling, shattering somewhere behind him, and his hand was already closing around Bractus's wrist. There was no scuffle, there was no struggle worth describing. Bractus made a small sound of surprise, then a small sound of pain, and then he was on the floor, with the knife skittering harmlessly across the marble, and Elias was kneeling beside me, with his hands hovering near my throat, checking for a wound that was not there. "You're not hurt," he said, and I could not tell if it was a question or a statement, because his voice held no panic at all, only a careful, focused calm that felt entirely wrong for what had just happened. "I'm not hurt," I confirmed, and my own voice came out steadier than I expected, though my hands were shaking badly enough that I had to press them together to stop. The hall erupted into noise after that, guards rushing in far too late to matter, nobles shouting questions. My father's personal guard captain, a grim woman named Drave, who had served my family for 20 years, arriving to find the situation already resolved by a man she had spent months quietly dismissing as decorative. I watched her face as she took in the scene. Bractus on the ground, disarmed, groaning. Elias kneeling beside me, calm as still water. Drave's eyes moved between the two of them, and I saw something shift behind her expression, something like a soldier recalculating a battlefield she thought she understood. "How?" she said, not quite a question, more a demand, aimed at the universe itself. Elias stood, brushing off his knees, and offered her the same easy smile he offered everyone. I was standing close enough to help, that's all. That was not all. Even in my shaken state, even with adrenaline still flooding through me, I understood that was not all. The distance between the wine table and where I had been standing was at least 6 long strides for a person of ordinary speed. Elias had crossed it, disarmed an attacker, and knelt beside me before most of the room had finished registering that something was wrong. Bractus was taken away for questioning. The rest of the evening dissolved into the chaos such events always create. Physicians checking me for injuries I did not have, guards doubling in number outside my chambers, my father arriving pale and furious, demanding answers that no one seemed able to give him. Through all of it, Elias stayed close to me, quiet and steady, answering questions from the investigators with the same easy, unremarkable tone he used for everything. Yes, he had reacted quickly. No, he did not know why. Instinct, he supposed. Adrenaline does strange things to a person. I did not believe him, not for a single moment. And that night, once the palace had finally gone quiet, and the guards outside our door had settled into their long vigil, I turned to him in the darkness of our chambers and asked the question I had been circling for months. "Who are you, Elias?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought he might simply pretend to be asleep, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to avoid a conversation about politics he found tedious. But then he sighed, a small, tired sound, and said, "I'm your husband. I'm a diplomat. I read too many books, and I make bad jokes at dinner parties." That's not an answer. It's the answer I've been giving for months. It's the answer that stopped making sense the moment you crossed this entire hall faster than my eyes could follow, disarmed a man twice your size without breaking a sweat, and then lied to a trained investigator about it not 20 minutes later. He was silent again, and this silence felt different from the others, heavier, more considered. I waited, refusing to fill the quiet the way I usually did, forcing him to be the one to break it. "There are things about my history that are not exactly secret," he said finally, "but they are not exactly public either. Earth has its own way of handling certain records, certain events. I am not permitted to discuss most of it, not because I don't trust you, but because the agreements that keep me from discussing it exist above both our authorities combined. That is a very diplomatic way of telling me nothing." "I'm a diplomat," he said, and I could hear, even in the dark, that he was almost smiling. "It's what I do." I did not press further that night, not because I had run out of questions, but because I recognized, even then, that pushing too hard against a locked door rarely opens it. Better to look for another way in. The investigation into Bractus's attempted attack concluded within the week, and the official explanation satisfied no one, least of all me. Bractus, it turned out, had acted alone, driven by some grievance about his family's fallen standing, and had somehow slipped past palace security with a weapon that should never have made it through the checkpoints. The official report called it a security failure, My father called it an embarrassment. I called it a story with too many convenient gaps in it, gaps that no one seemed particularly interested in filling. I began my own investigation shortly after, though I told no one, not even Elias, what I was doing. I started with the Palace Archives, the vast underground library that housed records stretching back generations, records of trade agreements and treaties, and the long, slow history of the Concorde's expansion across a dozen star systems. I was looking for anything, any small mention, any footnote that might explain why battle-hardened soldiers went quiet at the sound of my husband's name. It took me nearly 3 weeks of careful, secretive searching, conducted mostly during the late hours when the archive attendants had gone home and the great vaulted room belonged only to me and the dust of old records. I found nothing directly about Elias. His personal file, the one available to any member of the royal household through standard diplomatic channels, was almost aggressively boring. Education records, language certifications, a brief, unremarkable career summary describing years spent in minor diplomatic postings before his assignment to the Thessaline court. But I found something else, something adjacent, something that had clearly been filed incorrectly, tucked into a section of records dealing with early Concorde history that had nothing to do with diplomatic postings at all. A single folder, its edges worn soft from handling, labeled only with a string of numbers and the words "Restricted, Concorde Council authorization required." I should not have opened it. I understood that even as my hands reached for it, but I had spent 3 weeks chasing shadows, and here, finally, was something with weight to it, something that felt like it might actually answer the questions that had been keeping me awake. The folder was mostly empty. Whatever had once filled it had been removed, redacted, or transferred elsewhere, leaving only a handful of pages that someone, somewhere, had either forgotten to remove or had left behind on purpose. The pages described something called the compliance incident, though the details were sparse, hedged in careful bureaucratic language designed to obscure as much as it revealed. References to an early Concorde diplomatic mission gone wrong. References to a hostile fleet, unnamed, unspecified, that had attempted to seize a human settlement during the earliest, most uncertain years of Earth's contact with the wider galaxy. References to the fleet's sudden, complete withdrawal, described only as a resolution achieved through unconventional means. And at the very bottom of the last remaining page, half obscured by a water stain that had clearly not been an accident, a single name that had somehow survived whatever process had scrubbed the rest of the file clean: E. Marsh. I sat with that folder for a long time, the archive silent around me, the weight of what I had just found settling slowly into my chest, like a stone dropped into still water. I did not know, then, exactly what the compliance incident had been. I did not know what unconventional means had achieved the resolution the file described. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that the harmless diplomat sleeping in my bed had a history that the most powerful bureaucracy in the galaxy had gone to considerable trouble to hide. I returned to our chambers that night with the folder hidden beneath my cloak, my mind racing through 100 possibilities, each one stranger than the last. Elias was already asleep when I arrived, or pretending to be, and I stood over him for a long moment in the darkness, studying the unremarkable face of the man I had married, searching for some sign of the thing hidden beneath it. I did not confront him that night. I told myself it was because I needed more information first, because a single half-destroyed file was not enough to build an accusation on. The truth, I think, was closer to fear. Not fear of him, exactly, though there was some of that too. Fear, more than anything, of what it would mean if the man I had spent months learning to love was not who I believed him to be at all. The confrontation came 3 days later, and it came not because I finally worked up the courage to force it, but because Elias found the folder first. I had hidden it carelessly, tucked beneath a stack of correspondence in my private study, and I should have known better than to assume he would not notice. When I returned from an afternoon council session to find him sitting at my desk, the folder open in front of him, his expression unreadable in a way I had never seen on him before, I understood immediately that whatever careful, gradual approach I had been planning was no longer an option. "Where did you find this?" he asked, and his voice was quiet, but it carried a weight I had never heard from him before, something old and tired underneath the careful diplomatic calm. "The archives," I said. "It was misfiled. I wasn't looking for it specifically, not at first." "But you kept looking." "Yes." He closed the folder slowly, his fingers lingering on the worn edges of the cover, and for a long moment he simply sat there, staring at nothing, looking, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely uncertain about what to say. "I always knew this conversation would happen eventually," he said finally. "I suppose I hoped it would happen on my terms, not because you found half a story in a broken filing system and had to spend 3 weeks scaring yourself with the gaps." "Then tell me the rest of it," I said. "Tell me what the compliance incident actually was. Tell me what you did. Tell me why grown soldiers who have survived wars go quiet when they hear your name." He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, some decision finally made after what felt like months of careful avoidance. He gestured toward the chair across from the desk, and I sat, my heart pounding, bracing myself for an answer I was no longer certain I wanted. "It's not a short story," he said, "and it's not a comfortable one. Are you certain you want to hear all of it?" "I have spent 3 weeks, certain of nothing except that I need to hear it," I told him. "Yes, I am certain." He nodded slowly, folded his hands on top of the closed folder, and began to speak, and for the first time since I had married him, Elias Marsh told me the truth. "Earth joined the Concord later than almost every other founding world," Elias began, his voice steady, though something in his eyes had gone distant, the way a person's eyes go when they are looking at memories rather than the room around them. "We were new, unproven. Most of the older Concord worlds assumed we would need decades to understand how galactic politics actually worked, and for a while, that assumption served us well. No one takes a harmless species seriously enough to fear them." "That word again," I said quietly. "Harmless." "It's a useful word," he said. "People underestimate what they're not afraid of. We learned that lesson early, and we learned it the hard way." He told me about the early years, the first uncertain decade after Earth's discovery by the wider galaxy, when humanity had exactly one settlement beyond its home system, a small colony called Meridian Reach, built on a world with no strategic value except that it sat conveniently close to a trade corridor several older powers wanted for themselves. "There was a coalition," he said, 3 minor powers, none of them Concord members at the time, who decided that a new, unproven species with a single undefended colony was an easy target. They believed, correctly, that Earth had no fleet capable of defending Meridian Reach by force. They believed, incorrectly, that this meant Earth had no way to defend it at all. What happened? They sent a fleet, not a massive one, not by galactic standards, but more than enough to overwhelm anything humanity could have fielded in open combat. The plan was simple. Arrive, demonstrate overwhelming force, force the colony's surrender, and claim the trade corridor before the wider Concord even finished debating whether to intervene. And instead, he was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the worn edge of the folder without opening it. Instead, the fleet arrived to find that every single system aboard every single ship had already been compromised before they ever left their home ports. Navigation, communication, weapons targeting, life support monitoring, everything. Not damaged, not destroyed, simply held, quietly, invisibly, by people who had been inside those systems for months, without a single officer noticing. I stared at him, trying to understand what he was describing. "You're saying humanity defeated a fleet without firing a single shot?" "I'm saying humanity never needed to fire a shot to make the point. The fleet's commanders received a single message, delivered simultaneously to every ship in the formation, explaining exactly what had been done, exactly what could be done next, and exactly how little effort it had taken. The message ended with an invitation. Turn around, or discover what happens when the invisible hand holding your engines closed decides to stop being polite about it. They turned around. They turned around so fast that two of the ships nearly collided with each other, he said, and there was no pride in his voice when he said it, only a kind of tired weight, as though the memory itself was heavy to carry. That was the compliance incident. That is what the file you found was trying to describe, in the careful, bloodless language bureaucrats use when they want to describe something terrifying without admitting how terrifying it actually was. And you, I said slowly, the pieces beginning to align in my mind. You were part of this. He met my eyes, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his expression that I could only describe as old. Not old in years, though I suspected he had seen more than his easy, boyish face suggested. Old in the way a person becomes old when they have carried a weight for a very long time and learned to hide it well. I was the one who wrote the message, he said quietly, and I was the one who made sure it was true. I sat with that for a long moment, the study silent around us, except for the distant sound of the palace settling into evening, servants moving through hallways, guards changing posts, an entire world going about its ordinary business, while I tried to reconcile the man in front of me with the story he had just told. You were a soldier, I said finally. Not exactly. Earth did not send soldiers to defend Meridian Reach, not in the way your world understands soldiers. We sent people who understood systems, networks, the invisible architecture that holds modern fleets together. It turned out, in those early years, that humanity had an unusual talent for understanding those systems better than almost anyone else in the galaxy, in part because we had spent a very long time fighting wars against each other using exactly those kinds of tools before we ever left our own solar system. That's not an answer to what you did, I said. That's an answer to how you did it. I asked what you were. He exhaled slowly, and something in his posture shifted, some old formality falling away. I was the one they sent when quiet solutions were needed, instead of loud ones. I still am, in a sense, though these days the solutions I offer are diplomatic rather than technical. The skills don't disappear just because the job title changes. Is that why the veterans go quiet around you, the ones who were there? Some of them were on those ships, he said. Some of them spent that entire encounter believing their own weapons might turn against them at any moment, not knowing whether the hand holding their systems intended to let go peacefully or not. That kind of fear does not fade quickly. I understand why they prefer not to look at me directly. I remind them of the worst hour of their careers. I thought of Admiral Halvith, pale and trembling at the diplomatic reception, leaving early with a headache I had not believed for a moment. I thought of Korath's laughter fading just slightly before it should have, his eyes flicking toward Elias with something that, in hindsight, looked far more like caution than amusement. Why did no one tell me any of this? I asked. Before the marriage. Surely my father's advisors would have known. Some of them knew, Elias said. Enough to be careful about it, not enough to understand the full picture, because very few people alive today have the full picture. The Concord Council sealed most of the records decades ago. Officially, the compliance incident does not exist. Officially, I am exactly what my personnel file says I am, a minor diplomat with an unremarkable career, currently posted to the Thessaline court because Earth wanted to demonstrate good faith to a powerful ally. And unofficially? He smiled, though it did not reach his eyes the way his smiles usually did. Unofficially, I am the reason certain very old, very powerful people in this galaxy have spent the last several decades treating Earth's willingness to negotiate as a gift rather than an obligation. Diplomacy is easier when the other side understands, quietly, without it ever needing to be said aloud, exactly what the alternative looks like. I considered this for a long time, turning it over in my mind, trying to fit this new understanding against every memory I had of him, every small moment I had previously explained away as harmless eccentricity. The unshaken hands during the attack in the Great Hall, the unafraid walks through dangerous gardens, the languages learned with impossible speed, the scars he had explained away with a smooth, well-practiced lie about a childhood accident, a lie I now suspected covered something far less innocent. "The scars," I said, "on your arms, tell me the truth about those." He glanced down at his forearms, though the marks were hidden beneath his sleeves. "Not every problem can be solved quietly," he said. "Some solutions require a more direct approach, and direct approaches sometimes leave marks. I told you a story about a childhood accident because it was easier than explaining the truth to someone I was still hoping might simply see me as an ordinary husband. Was that ever going to be possible?" I asked, and I heard, in my own voice, something that surprised me, a note that was not quite anger and not quite fear, something closer to grief for the simple version of him I had briefly believed I understood. "I hoped so," he said quietly. "I still hope so, honestly, even now, even with all of this sitting between us. I never wanted this marriage to be built on a lie. I wanted time. Time to become someone you knew for who I actually am, rather than someone you learned about through a broken file in an underground archive." I did not have an answer for that, not immediately. I sat with the weight of everything he had told me, the fear and the strange, unwilling admiration tangled together in a way I did not fully understand, and I found myself asking a question I had not expected to ask. "Are you dangerous to me?" His expression softened immediately, all of the old weight falling away, replaced by something achingly familiar, the same gentle, patient look he had given me on our first meeting, when he had bowed at the wrong angle and apologized with a smile. "Veyron," he said, using my full name, which he rarely did, "I have never once, in my entire life, been dangerous to anyone who was not actively trying to hurt someone I care about. Everything I have ever done, every quiet solution, and every uncomfortable memory those veterans carry, exists because I was trying to protect something. You are the last person in this galaxy I would ever want to frighten." I believed him. I am not certain, even now, exactly why I believed him so quickly, given everything I had just learned. Perhaps it was the steadiness in his voice. Perhaps it was months of watching him treat servants with kindness they did not expect, of watching him walk unarmed through dangerous gardens, not out of foolishness, but out of a confidence so deep it had never occurred to him he might need protecting. Perhaps it was simply that some part of me had already begun falling in love with the version of him hidden beneath the harmless mask, long before I understood what that version actually was. "There's more, isn't there?" I said. "More than just the compliance incident. More than just old history." He hesitated, and that hesitation told me more than any answer could have. "There are people coming," he said finally. "Not soon, not tomorrow, but soon enough that I have been dreading this conversation for exactly this reason. Powerful people. Old people, in ways that go beyond simple years. They have heard rumors about what happened during the compliance incident. Rumors that have grown larger and stranger with every retelling over the decades. And they want to know, for reasons of their own, whether those rumors are true." "What kind of people?" He looked at me, and for the first time since this conversation began, I saw something in his expression that I recognized immediately, because I had felt it myself only moments before, standing in the archive with a half-destroyed file in my hands, understanding that the world was far larger and stranger than I had ever been trained to expect. "The kind of people," he said quietly, "that most of the galaxy still calls gods." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible, and I found myself laughing, a short, disbelieving sound that held no real humor in it at all. "Gods," I repeated. "You are telling me that gods are coming to our court." I am telling you that certain ancient beings, beings old enough and powerful enough that entire civilizations still worship them, still build temples for them, still shape their laws around their supposed wishes, have taken an interest in the rumors surrounding my history. I am telling you they are curious whether an ordinary human diplomat truly turned back a hostile fleet using nothing but patience and quiet skill, or whether the story has grown into something larger than the truth over the years. And if they discover the story is true. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice had gone very soft, very careful, the voice of a man choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much weight they carried. Then we will find out together, he said, whether even gods know how to be careful around something they don't fully understand. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, trying to reconcile the gentle, patient man I had married with the quiet architect of a fleet's surrender, with the keeper of secrets old enough to draw the attention of beings, the galaxy itself, still called divine. I thought of Korath's nervous laughter. I thought of Admiral Halveth's trembling hands. I thought of every small, dismissed detail I had spent months explaining away as harmless eccentricity. Harmless. I turned the word over and over in my mind until it lost all meaning, until it became nothing more than a sound, a convenient lie the entire galaxy had agreed to tell itself about a man who had simply never needed to prove otherwise. Somewhere in the darkness beyond our windows, I knew the gods were already turning their attention toward our small, ordinary court, drawn by rumors of a fleet that had surrendered without a fight, and a man the record books insisted on calling nothing more than a minor diplomat. I did not yet know how right they were to be curious. I did not yet know how wrong they were to assume that curiosity would come without a cost. The visitors arrived 11 days later, and the court dressed the occasion up as a trade negotiation, though everyone who mattered understood it was nothing of the sort. I watched from the high balcony above the receiving hall as their ships settled into the courtyard, vessels unlike anything I had seen before, built from materials that seemed to bend light around themselves rather than simply reflect it. My father's advisors had spent the entire week in a state of barely controlled panic, arranging protocols for guests whose proper titles no one in our archives could fully agree on. Some called them elders. Some called them the old choir. Some, in hushed voices that carried genuine fear, simply called them the gods, and did not bother explaining further, as though the word alone should be enough to command the proper respect. There were 5 of them, representing 5 different ancient lineages, 5 different pantheons still worshipped across a dozen star systems whose civilizations had existed for so long that Thessaline history, proud as it was, looked like a single page torn from the beginning of a very long book. They did not look the way I expected gods to look. I had imagined towering figures wreathed in light, or beings so strange that my mind would struggle to process their shapes. Instead, they arrived as 5 individuals of varying, almost ordinary appearance, dressed in simple robes, walking without escort, without visible weapons, without any of the theater I had braced myself for. That, I would come to understand, was precisely the point. Beings that old did not need theater. Their reputation did the work theater would otherwise have to do. The eldest among them, a figure who introduced herself only as Sylvain, spoke first when the formal greetings had concluded and the court had settled into the tense, careful silence that always followed such introductions. Her voice was quiet, almost gentle, and yet it carried through the enormous hall as though the architecture itself had been built specifically to serve her words. "We have come," she said, "because a story has reached us that we find difficult to believe and difficult to ignore. A story about a fleet that surrendered without a shot fired. A story about a species young enough to still be finding its feet in this galaxy, and yet somehow capable of humbling powers that have existed for centuries. Her eyes moved across the assembled court, unhurried, until they settled on Elias, who stood beside me near the front of the receiving line, dressed in the same unremarkable formal attire he always wore, looking, as he always looked, like the least significant person in the room. "We have come to see the truth of this story for ourselves," Sylvain said, "and we have come to see whether the man at its center is truly what the rumors claim, or whether decades of retelling have simply built a myth around an ordinary diplomat who happened to be present for someone else's cleverness." The words hung in the air, and I felt my heart begin to pound, understanding immediately what was happening beneath the polite, formal language. This was not a trade negotiation, this was a test, and the entire court, my father included, had simply agreed to host it because refusing an audience with beings called gods was not something even the proudest of nations dared to attempt. My father, to his credit, tried to steer the conversation toward safer ground, offering pleasantries about trade routes and diplomatic exchange, but Sylvain's attention did not waver from Elias, and eventually, even my father's careful deflections fell silent under the weight of her patience. "Diplomat Marsh," she said, using his formal title with a precision that made it sound almost like a challenge in itself. "Walk with us. There is much we would discuss, and I find such conversations proceed more honestly, away from an audience eager to record every word for their own purposes." I stepped forward before I fully decided to, some instinct rising in me that refused to let him walk into that conversation alone. "I will accompany my husband," I said, and I heard the surprise ripple through the court at my boldness, addressing beings the entire galaxy treated with reverent fear as though I had any right to insert myself into their invitation. Sylvain studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then, unexpectedly, something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed her ancient features. "Yes," she said, "I believe you should. Come." We walked together through the palace gardens, the 5 ancient beings, Elias, and myself, while the rest of the court remained behind, no doubt already spinning 100 theories about what was being discussed beyond their hearing. The gardens, usually a place of quiet beauty, felt smaller somehow, pressed close by the weight of the company keeping me. "Tell us honestly," Sylvain said, once we had walked far enough that only the 5 of them, Elias, and I remained within earshot. "The compliance incident. We have read the sealed reports, or what remains of them after your Concord's careful editing. We have heard the rumors your own people whisper about a man who defeated a fleet with nothing but patience. We wish to hear it from you directly, without the careful language your government prefers." Elias did not answer immediately. He walked in silence for several long strides, his expression thoughtful, and I found myself holding my breath, uncertain what version of the truth he intended to offer beings powerful enough that an honest answer might carry consequences none of us could predict. "The story is true," he said finally. "Every fleet system was compromised before the ships ever left port. The message was real. The withdrawal was real. I wrote that message myself, and I made certain, personally, that every word in it was accurate, because a threat built on exaggeration is worthless the moment someone calls its bluff." One of the other beings, a tall, silent figure who had not yet spoken, tilted his head slightly, studying Elias with new interest. "And if they had called your bluff," he said, his voice deep and slow, like stone grinding against stone, "what then?" "There was no bluff to call," Elias said simply. "Everything in that message was already true before it was sent. That was the entire point. I do not make threats I cannot fulfill. I have found, over many years, that it is a habit which saves a great deal of unnecessary conflict." Sylvain's eyes narrowed slightly, not with hostility, but with something closer to careful reassessment. "A convenient philosophy," she said, "for a species young enough that the rest of the galaxy still expected you to need decades before understanding how power actually functions among the old civilizations." "Perhaps," Elias said, Or perhaps we simply arrived already understanding something your civilizations learned centuries ago and have since grown comfortable enough to forget. Power that must constantly announce itself is usually compensating for something. The quietest threats tend to be the ones worth actually fearing. The words landed with a weight I felt rather than heard, a ripple of tension moving through the 5 ancient figures surrounding us. I glanced at Elias, searching his face for some sign of fear, some acknowledgement of exactly how dangerous a room he was standing in, and found instead the same calm, patient expression he wore during court dinners and diplomatic receptions, as though these 5 beings, who could reshape star systems with a thought, were no more threatening to him than Korath's clumsy insults had ever been. "We did not travel this distance," said the stone-voiced figure, "to be lectured on humility by a species that has existed as a spacefaring power for barely 2 centuries. No," Elias agreed easily. "You traveled this distance because you heard a story about a fleet surrendering without a fight, and it frightened you enough that you needed to see for yourselves whether it was true. I understand that impulse. I would be curious too, in your position." The stone-voiced figure's expression darkened, and I felt the temperature of the garden seem to drop, though whether that was truly happening or simply my own fear translating itself into physical sensation, I could not say. Sylvain raised a hand, a small, unhurried gesture that nonetheless silenced her companion instantly. "You are either remarkably brave," she said to Elias, "or remarkably foolish, speaking to us this way." "I am neither, particularly," Elias said. "I am simply honest. You came here to determine whether the story about me is true. I have told you the truth. What you choose to do with that truth is entirely your own decision, and I would not presume to tell beings of your age and experience how to make it." Sylvain studied him for a long, silent moment, and I found myself studying her in turn, trying to read some sign of what she intended, some hint of whether this conversation was moving toward peace or toward something far more dangerous. When she finally spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, though the weight behind it remained. "There is a tradition," she said, "among the old civilizations, when questions like this arise about a claim too large to simply accept on faith. A demonstration. Not a battle, not in the crude sense your younger worlds might imagine, but a test of capability, conducted under controlled conditions, witnessed by those whose judgment carries weight across 100 star systems." I felt my stomach tighten with dread, understanding immediately what she was describing. "You want to test him," I said, unable to keep the fear from my voice. "In front of witnesses, in front of your entire court." "I want the truth confirmed," Sylvain said, turning her ancient eyes toward me with something that might have been sympathy. "For everyone's sake, princess, including yours. If the rumors about your husband are exaggerated, better the galaxy understands that now, before misplaced fear leads to poor decisions on all sides. And if the rumors are true—" She paused, glancing back at Elias with an expression I could not fully read. "Then the entire Concord deserves to understand exactly what kind of power has been living quietly among them, calling itself Harmless." Elias was quiet for a long moment, considering this, and I found myself gripping his arm without fully deciding to, some instinct rising in me that refused to let him face whatever came next without knowing, absolutely, that I stood beside him rather than behind him. "Very well," he said finally. "A demonstration then. Tomorrow, if that suits you. I would rather resolve this quickly than let it linger over the court like a storm that never quite arrives." Sylvain nodded, satisfaction, and something else, something almost like anticipation, crossing her ancient features. "Tomorrow then, at the Great Hall, before the full court and every witness of standing we can gather on short notice. We will see, once and for all, whether the harmless diplomat is truly harmless, or whether the galaxy has been keeping a very dangerous secret quiet for far too long." She turned and walked away, her 4 companions following, and Elias and I stood alone in the garden as the evening light faded around us, the weight of tomorrow's demonstration settling over both of us like a physical thing. "You didn't have to agree to that," I said quietly, once they were far enough away. "You could have refused." "I could have," he agreed, "but refusing would have told them exactly what they wanted to know anyway. Beings like that read hesitation as confirmation. Better to walk toward the question directly than let them draw their own conclusions from my reluctance." "Are you afraid?" I asked, and I realized, as I asked it, that I already knew the answer, or thought I did, based on months of watching him face every danger with the same unshaken calm. He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, some careful mask falling away entirely, leaving only the tired, honest man beneath it. "A little," he admitted. "Not for myself, for what happens after tomorrow, regardless of how it goes. Once beings like that understand exactly what I am, that knowledge doesn't simply disappear. It changes things. It changes how the entire galaxy looks at Earth, and at you, and at this marriage we built together." I took his hand in the fading light, feeling the same steady calm in his fingers that I had felt the night the knife touched my throat, and something in me settled, some fear quieting beneath a growing, unfamiliar certainty. "Then let them see," I said. "Let them understand exactly what they're dealing with. I am done watching this entire galaxy call you harmless when I have seen, with my own eyes, exactly how untrue that word has always been." He smiled at that, a real smile, the first one I had seen from him since the confrontation over the folder in my study, and for a moment, standing together in the darkening garden with gods walking away toward tomorrow's reckoning, I felt something I had not expected to feel, given everything the last few weeks had revealed. I felt proud of him, not despite what he was, but entirely because of it. Tomorrow, the gods would have their demonstration. Tomorrow, the entire court would finally see the truth that I had spent months, slowly, painfully, uncovering on my own. And whatever happened in that great hall, whatever the demonstration revealed, I intended to stand beside him through every moment of it, exactly as I had promised myself I would in the quiet dark of that garden. The great hall had never held so many witnesses in living memory. Every seat had been filled by dawn. Nobles from every allied house crowded shoulder to shoulder, Concord officials who had traveled through the night to arrive in time, and scattered among them, quiet and watchful, the veterans I had noticed months earlier growing pale at the mention of my husband's name. Admiral Halveth sat near the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and when her eyes found mine across the crowded hall, she offered a small, tired nod, as though acknowledging a truth we had both been circling for a very long time. Sylvain and her 4 companions stood at the center of the hall when I arrived, unhurried, patient, radiating the same quiet authority they had carried through the gardens the evening before. Elias stood near the entrance, dressed exactly as he always dressed, in clothes too ordinary for the weight of what was about to happen, and when I reached his side, he offered me the same easy smile he had given me on the day we first met, 40 degrees off from proper etiquette, apologizing for a mistake that had never actually mattered. "Are you ready?" I asked quietly. "I've been ready for a very long time," he said. "I simply hoped I would never need to be." Sylvain raised her hand, and the murmuring crowd fell into immediate, absolute silence, the kind of silence that comes only when an entire room understands, instinctively, that something significant is about to happen. "We are gathered," she said, her voice carrying easily through the enormous hall, "to determine the truth of a story that has traveled far beyond its origins, growing stranger and larger with every retelling. A story about a human diplomat who is said to have turned back an entire hostile fleet, using nothing but patience and quiet skill. Today we will see whether that story reflects reality, or whether it has become something closer to legend than fact." She turned toward Elias, and the crowd's attention followed hers entirely, hundreds of eyes fixed on the unremarkable man standing beside me. "The terms are simple," Sylvain continued. we will present a series of challenges, each designed to test different aspects of the capability the rumors describe. Nothing that risks permanent harm to anyone present. We are not barbarians, whatever your younger species might assume about our methods. But we will see, clearly and without doubt, exactly what this man is capable of, and exactly how much of the story surrounding him reflects truth. Elias nodded, calm as ever, and stepped forward into the open center of the hall, where the 5 ancient beings waited. The first challenge came from the stone-voiced figure, whose name I learned was Corvith, one of the oldest among them, a being who had apparently overseen the collapse of 3 separate galactic empires across his impossibly long existence. He produced, from somewhere within his robes, a small device unlike anything I had seen before, a sphere of dark metal covered in shifting patterns of light. This, Corvith said, contains a security architecture developed by my own people, refined over 11 centuries, considered unbreakable by every civilization that has ever attempted to breach it. If the story about the fleet is true, if you truly possess the skill the rumors describe, this should present no significant challenge. He set the sphere on a small pedestal at the center of the hall and stepped back. Elias approached it without hesitation, studying it for a long moment with the same calm, careful attention he gave to everything, and then knelt beside it, his hands moving with quick, precise motions that I could not follow, patterns of light shifting and reforming across the sphere's surface in response to whatever he was doing. The hall held its breath. I held mine along with it, watching my husband work with an intensity of focus I had never seen from him before. The easy, unremarkable diplomat replaced entirely by something sharper, something older, something that had clearly done this exact kind of work more times than the redacted files could ever fully document. It took him 4 minutes. I counted every second of it, watching the shifting patterns of light slow, then stabilize, then finally go dark entirely, the sphere's surface settling into stillness. Elias stood, brushing off his knees the same way he had brushed them off after disarming Bractus in this very hall, and looked toward Corvith with an expression of polite, patient apology. "I'm sorry," he said. "I may have been slightly rough with it. 11 centuries of refinement, and it still assumed the greatest threat to its security would come from outside the architecture, rather than from someone who simply understood how the architecture itself was built to think." Corvith stared at the darkened sphere for a long moment, his ancient features unreadable, and when he finally looked up, something in his expression had shifted, the careful skepticism replaced by something closer to genuine unease. 4 minutes, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else in the hall. It has withstood every attempt for 11 centuries. 4 minutes. The second challenge came from a quiet, watchful being named Ilsara, who introduced a different kind of test entirely, a complex negotiation scenario involving simulated representatives from 3 fictional star nations, each with conflicting demands, designed to test not raw skill, but the careful, patient diplomacy the rumors also claimed Elias possessed. I watched him navigate the scenario with the same unhurried patience he brought to every dinner party conversation, finding common ground between impossible positions, diffusing manufactured tensions with small, well-placed observations, resolving in under an hour a scenario that Ilsara later admitted had been designed to remain unsolvable. The third challenge, the fourth, the fifth, each one different, each one designed by a different ancient being to test a different aspect of the story that had brought them across the galaxy, and each one met with the same calm, unhurried competence that had characterized every quiet moment I had spent married to this man without ever fully understanding what I was witnessing. By the time Sylvain called for the final challenge, the mood in the hall had shifted entirely. The whispers that had filled the room at the beginning had faded into a heavy, watchful silence, and even the ancient beings themselves, beings who had walked into this hall with careful, patient skepticism, now watched Elias with expressions I recognized immediately, because I had worn that same expression myself for months without understanding what it meant. Fear, wrapped carefully in respect. One final matter, Sylvain said, and something in her voice had changed too, the polite formality replaced by something quieter, more genuine. Not a challenge of skill this time, but a question of intent. You have proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the rumors surrounding the compliance incident are not exaggeration. You possess exactly the capability the story describes, and likely far more that has never made its way into any file, sealed or otherwise. That's likely true, Elias agreed simply. Then I ask you directly, in front of every witness gathered here, the question that has truly brought us across this galaxy. Why have you never used this capability for anything beyond quiet defense? A being with your skill could reshape entire star systems, could claim power that most of the ancient houses in this hall would kill for the chance to hold. Why choose instead to live quietly, as an unremarkable diplomat married into a court that mocked you for months before finally understanding what you actually were? Elias considered the question for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried none of the careful diplomatic polish he usually wore. It carried something simpler, something that felt, to me, like the truest thing I had ever heard him say. Because power that exists only to be used eventually consumes the person holding it, he said. I have seen it happen, across a dozen civilizations, across 1,000 years of history, that your own people, Sylvain, understand better than I ever will. Power that goes looking for reasons to prove itself always finds them, and it never stops finding them, until there is nothing left of the person who once held it responsibly. I would rather be underestimated for the rest of my life than become the kind of being that needs constant proof of its own significance. He glanced toward me then, and something in his expression softened, the last of the careful formality falling away entirely. Besides, he added, I found something worth protecting quietly, rather than something worth ruling loudly. I have found that quiet is usually enough. The hall remained silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, and then, slowly, deliberately, Sylvain did something that sent a visible ripple of shock through every witness gathered in that enormous room. She lowered herself, gracefully and without hesitation, into a formal bow of respect, the kind reserved only for beings of equal or greater standing, and her 4 companions, after only the briefest hesitation, followed her example, one by one, until all 5 ancient beings stood bowed before my husband in the center of the great hall. We came, Sylvain said, rising slowly, expecting to find either an exaggerated legend or a dangerous weapon that the galaxy had somehow overlooked. We found instead something far rarer than either, a being with the power to reshape star systems, who chose instead to spend his days learning the names of servants and apologizing for imperfect bows. That kind of restraint is not weakness, Diplomat Marsh. Among beings as old as we are, who have watched power destroy civilization after civilization across centuries beyond your species' understanding, that kind of restraint is the single rarest and most valuable quality that exists. She turned toward the assembled court, her voice rising to carry across the entire silent hall. Let it be understood by every witness gathered here today that the Concord's newest member has demonstrated something few civilizations ever managed to demonstrate at any point in their history. Strength held quietly, in service of protection rather than conquest. We will carry this understanding back to our own peoples, and Earth standing among the old civilizations will reflect it accordingly. The hall erupted into stunned, overwhelming noise after that, 100 conversations breaking out at once, nobles who had spent months mocking my husband now staring at him with expressions of dawning, disbelieving respect. Korath, I noticed, sat frozen near the back of the hall, his face pale, no doubt reliving every clumsy insult he had ever aimed at the man who had just made ancient gods bow in a crowded room. I did not join the noise. I simply walked to Elias's side, taking his hand in mine, and felt him relax, slowly, the careful tension of the last several weeks finally beginning to ease from his shoulders. "Harmless," I said quietly, just for him, the word that had followed him through every dinner party and diplomatic reception since the day he first arrived at this palace. "That's what they used to call you." "They weren't entirely wrong," he said, smiling the same easy, imperfect smile he had given me on the day we met. "I have never once wanted to hurt anyone who wasn't actively trying to hurt someone I love. That's not harmlessness. Exactly. But it's close enough to the same thing for anyone lucky enough to never test it directly." I thought of the months I had spent believing I had married a gentle, forgettable man, pitying him quietly while the rest of the court mocked him openly. I thought of the knife at my throat, gone in 3 heartbeats. I thought of the archive folder, half destroyed, hiding a truth too large for any file to fully contain. I thought of 5 ancient beings, worshipped as gods across a dozen star systems, bowing in a crowded hall because the truest strength they had ever encountered had spent months quietly learning the names of palace servants instead of announcing itself to anyone at all. I understood, finally, standing there with his hand in mine while the entire court buzzed with disbelief around us, that I had never actually needed to protect him from anything. I had simply needed to see him clearly, the way I finally saw him now, not as the harmless diplomat the court had mocked, and not as the quiet architect of a fleet's surrender either, but as something far simpler than either version, and far more remarkable because of it. A man who understood, better than any warrior or any god in that hall, that the deepest strength a person could carry was the discipline to never need it announced. The gods had come searching for a legend, and found instead a quiet husband who apologized for imperfect bows. They left our court that evening with a respect that would echo across a dozen star systems for generations to come, and I stayed behind, standing beside the man the entire galaxy had once called Harmless, finally understanding that I had never once been wrong to love him. I had only ever been wrong about why.